There are moments in nature that don't fit neatly into anything we were taught. Moments that make you set down whatever you're doing and just watch. What Daniel witnessed one ordinary morning behind his home in the rural outskirts of Tennessee was exactly that kind of moment, and for weeks he told almost no one because he knew how it would sound. The land behind Daniel's property had always drawn wildlife. White-tailed deer moved through the tree line at dusk. Wild turkeys crossed the open grass in the early hours, and the occasional fox would pause at the edge of the yard before vanishing back into the brush. Daniel had lived here long enough to know the rhythms of the land, what was normal, what wasn't, and what deserved a second look. So when a young white-tailed deer appeared at the far edge of his fence one quiet Tuesday morning, he noticed, but he didn't think much of it. Not at first. The deer was a buck, young but not small, maybe 2 years old, with the beginning of antler growth just visible above his ears. He stood at the fence line with a stillness that felt deliberate, not frozen in alarm, not poised to run, just still. His ears moved slowly, reading the air, but his eyes were fixed on something deeper inside the yard. Daniel followed his gaze, and that's when he felt the first pull of something he couldn't name. Inside the large enclosed habitat behind Daniel's home lived Luna, a female bobcat he had taken in nearly 8 months earlier. She had been found on the side of a rural highway, struck by a vehicle, her right rear leg badly damaged. A wildlife rehabilitator had stabilized her, but the injury had left her with a permanent limitation. Luna could move, she could run short distances, climb carefully, and navigate her enclosure with quiet confidence, but she could no longer survive the demands of the wild. She couldn't hunt with the speed and precision a bobcat needs. Releasing her back into the forest would have been a death sentence, so Daniel had worked with local wildlife authorities to become her permanent caretaker, building a spacious, naturalistic enclosure where Luna could live with dignity, if not with freedom. She had adjusted in the way wild animals sometimes do, not by becoming tame but by becoming settled. She still carried herself like a predator. She still watched everything. But the sharp urgency that defines a wild cat in its territory had softened into something quieter. Luna spent her mornings in a patch of sunlight near the old cedar tree at the center of her enclosure, and her afternoons watching the yard with half-closed eyes, cataloging every sound and movement the way cats do, not out of hunger but out of habit. That morning, Luna was exactly where she always was, resting near the cedar, her spotted coat dappled by the early light filtering through the branches. Daniel expected her to ignore the deer at the fence, or at most to stir with that low, instinctive alertness that predators show when prey is near. He braced for it, actually. He was already thinking about whether the deer was close enough to cause Luna distress, whether he should move toward the fence to redirect the deer back into the tree line. But Luna didn't tense. She opened her eyes fully, and for a long moment she simply looked. Then, slowly, with no urgency, she rose from her resting spot and padded toward the fence. Not low to the ground, not in a stalk, just walking. The way you walk toward something familiar. She reached the fence and sat down, no more than 4 feet from where the deer stood on the other side. Daniel didn't move. He wasn't sure he breathed. The deer lowered his head slightly. Not in submission, not grazing, just a small and quiet gesture, and the two animals regarded each other through the fence with an expression that Daniel would later struggle to describe. There was no fear on the deer's face. There was no aggression in Luna's posture. There was only the kind of stillness that living things sometimes settle into when they feel, against all odds, that they are safe. They stayed like that for nearly 4 minutes. Then the deer turned, unhurried, and walked back into the tree line. Luna watched him go. Then she turned and walked back to the cedar tree, circled once, and lay down again. Daniel stood in his yard for a long time after that, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. He told himself it was an anomaly, a young deer that hadn't yet learned the appropriate fear, a bobcat that was simply too settled in her routine to be stirred into instinct by a visitor at the fence. There were reasonable explanations. He reached for all of them. But the next morning, when he stepped out onto his back porch with his coffee, the deer was already there, standing at the same spot, in the same stillness, and Luna was already walking toward him, building the strange routine, tension through repetition and quiet detail. Here is 7 days passed, then 10, then 2 weeks, and every single morning, without exception, the deer returned. Daniel began noting the times in a small journal he kept on the kitchen counter. 7:12, 7:08, 7:19. The variation was never more than a few minutes, close enough that Daniel started waking up early just to be outside when it happened. He told himself he was monitoring the situation, making sure nothing escalated, but the truth was simpler than that. He didn't want to miss it. The routine had taken on a shape all its own. The deer would emerge from the tree line at the southeastern corner of the property, cross the open grass at an unhurried walk, and stop at the same section of fence, a spot near the corner post where a gap in the cedar branches let in a wide band of morning light. Luna, as if she had her own internal clock synchronized to his, would already be moving toward the fence by the time he arrived. Daniel never once saw her startle at his approach. Never once saw her drop into a crouch, or fix him with the focused, unblinking stare of a hunter sizing up prey. She simply walked to meet him, sat down and settled in. Some mornings they stayed close to the fence for only a few minutes before the deer would turn and graze nearby, moving slowly along the fence line while Luna watched from a few feet away. Other mornings they simply sat in silence for a quarter of an hour, the deer occasionally lowering his nose toward the ground, Luna occasionally closing her eyes halfway, both of them breathing the same cool morning air as though there were nowhere else either of them needed to be. Daniel started recording the visits on his phone. Not to post them, not yet. He wasn't even sure he believed what he was seeing, and he had no interest in trying to convince strangers of something he couldn't fully explain himself. He recorded them because he was afraid that without evidence he would eventually start to doubt his own memory, that he would soften the details over time, the way we do with things that feel too unlikely to hold on to whole. Because what he was watching shouldn't have been happening. Every instinct these two animals carried, written into their blood across thousands of years of evolution, said this was wrong. Predator and prey did not seek each other out. They did not share space willingly. They did not sit together in the early morning light as though the world's oldest rules simply didn't apply to them. And yet, morning after morning, that is exactly what they did. Building toward the emotional climax, the moment everything becomes clear. It was a Thursday evening when everything shifted. Daniel had grown so accustomed to the morning visits that when the deer didn't appear at his usual spot by 7:30, he assumed the day would simply pass without one. It happened occasionally, a missed morning here and there that Daniel had learned not to read too deeply into. Wildlife moved on its own logic. He accepted that. He went inside, refilled his coffee, and got on with his day. But just before dusk, something made him look out the back window. The deer was there, standing at the fence in the long golden light of early evening, in an hour he had never come before. Daniel set down what he was holding and moved quietly toward the back door, and then he stopped. Because the deer was not alone. Partially hidden in the shadow of the tree line, barely visible at first, stood a fawn, small and spotted, legs still carrying that uncertain newness that fawns have in their first weeks of life. It didn't approach the fence, it stayed back, watching, the way young animals watch when they are learning whether something is safe. The older deer stood his ground at the fence and waited. Luna came to meet him, the same as always. She approached without hurry, without tension, and settled into her familiar spot on the other side of the fence. And in that moment, Daniel watched the buck do something that stopped the breath in his chest. Rather than stepping back, rather than placing himself between the predator and his young, the deer simply turned his head toward the fawn, as if to say, "Come and see." The fawn didn't come forward, but it didn't flee either. Daniel stood very still for a long time, watching the three of them hold that quiet triangle, the bobcat, the buck, and the small, uncertain creature in the shadows, learning what its father already somehow knew. He thought about Luna then, about the injury that had taken her speed, her range, her ability to survive alone in the wild, about the long, slow months she had spent adjusting to a life lived inside a fence, and he thought about what this deer had figured out, or perhaps simply felt, that no human observer had been able to fully articulate until now. Luna was not a threat, not anymore. Maybe the deer had sensed it from the very first morning, something in her stillness, her unhurried walk, the absence of that coiled predatory energy that prey animals recognize before they recognize anything else. She had lost something, and somehow, across every boundary nature had drawn between them, he had known. Bringing the story home, not with a dramatic ending, but with the quiet weight of something real and fleeting, here is: the seasons turned the way they always do in Tennessee, gradually, then all at once. The mornings grew cooler. The light shifted from the soft gold of late summer into something thinner and more honest. The tree line behind Daniel's property deepened into color, and the open grass took on that dry, faded quality that signals a landscape preparing itself for dormancy. Daniel noticed all of it the way he always did, but this year he noticed it differently, because the visits had begun to change. The deer still came, but not every day now. Some mornings the fence stood empty and the yard stayed quiet, and Luna would wait by the cedar tree a little longer than usual before settling back into her routine. The gaps between visits stretched from 1 day to 2, then 3. Daniel told himself it was natural. The deer had a life that extended far beyond this fence line, a territory to maintain, a fawn to guide through its first winter, instincts pulling him deeper into the rhythms of the cold season. It made sense. He repeated that to himself on the quiet mornings. Then one frost-edged morning in late November, the deer didn't come, and he didn't come the next day, or the one after that. A week passed, then 2. Daniel found himself stepping out onto the back porch each morning with his coffee, looking toward the southeastern corner of the property out of a habit he hadn't decided to form. The gap in the cedar branches where the morning light came through. The corner fence post worn smooth in one spot. Luna still walked to that place sometimes, in the early hours when the yard was still in gray. She would sit there for a while, her eyes on the tree line, her ears moving slowly. Then she would turn and go back to her cedar tree. Daniel never saw the deer again. He never learned what became of him, whether he had simply moved his territory further out, following the season and the fawn into deeper woods, or whether the wild had finally collected what it was always owed. He didn't know, and after a while he stopped needing to. What he kept instead was simpler and more durable than an answer. He had watched 2 creatures, shaped by instinct to fear and avoid one another, choose something quieter and stranger and more enduring than either survival or threat. No one had taught them to do it. No one had arranged it or explained it or made it safe. They had simply found each other on opposite sides of a fence in the early morning light and decided, without language, without reason, that this was enough.